Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mukherjee. I'm a healthcare writer for Fortune magazine. I also write and produce our daily digital health newsletter, Brainstorm Health Daily. Shameless plug, please subscribe, it's free. Let's get this started. First off, Cal obviously just introduced himself. We have an excellent panel here. I'm going to go down the list. We have Casper de Clercq, who is the general partner at Norwest Venture Partners. Yep. We have McCann, who is the president and CEO of Pear Therapeutics. We have Bertrand, who's the chief digital officer at Novartis. And we have Vijay, Lathi, who's the managing director at New Leaf Ventures. So our panel obviously comes from a very kind of wide array up and down the spectrum of digital healthcare. So what I hope to have today is a really a conversation between all of you about the state of digital health right now. In 2017, digital health venture money totaled around $10 billion. So this is a field that's attracting a lot of attention, a lot of interest from players up and down sort of the pharmaceutical industry. But as of right now, we're still at the very early stages of actually realizing the potential of digital health technologies. So today, I'd like to talk about the aspirational elements of digital health, but I also want to talk about what's actually happening on the ground right now when it comes to implementing these technologies and what are the hurdles to realizing their full potential. So let me start off with a question for each of you. Right now, what's the number one factor that's holding back the full potential of using digital health technologies to improve population health and bring down costs? Let's start with you, Cal.
Thanks, I appreciate you introducing everybody and for moderating this panel. So we're seeing a broad set of issues, but if I had to pinpoint one issue, Ryan, we're not seeing that. It's this lack of focus on scalability. I think what I've seen in my own career and when I see sort of sitting in the perch at BrightInsight, where we get to work across so many pharma and medtech companies, is see a lot of things that start in terms of a great idea, and they get designed and orchestrated, and you can see where it's going to go to prove out, let's say, a scientific data point. But it's really lacking, okay, well, how do you take that innovation and bring it to real scalability, right? To your point around making a difference at a population level. Pharma and medtech know how to do that in terms of their traditional products, right? Most companies are operating in 100 to 200 global markets, and they can get pretty rapidly a drug or a medical device approved in a key market and then have a nice global rollout plan for it. We haven't seen that kind of infrastructure, even within a country, to innovate on a digital level and then to be able to meaningfully scale that.
Okay. Casper?
Sure. So I'm on the venture capital side, so we spend a lot of time with smaller companies, and I think one of the advantages they have is this nimbleness and the willingness to learn. And I would summarize it based on doing this for 10 years now on the wearable side and digital health front, that what most people neglect is the usability factor for patients, members, participants, whatever you want to call them. And I call it the sort of the value versus friction ratio. How much work do I have to do to get something out? And I think the assumption that a lot of people make is, look, if we create a form or we ask for some feedback, of course, they're my patients. They're going to fill in the form. And as we've learned with Alexa, with Uber these days, Uber knows, for example, in the morning, I'm off to go to work because it's 8 o'clock or 7:30, and I'm going in that general direction. So we're moving, hopefully, very quickly from this idea of filling in forms to doing ambient sensing, where effectively the participant has very little work to do. And I think the next phase will actually be anticipation based on, so it's effectively giving you something for free is the way I think we have to think about a patient engagement. We know that even in the case of injectables, I'd say, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but something like 50% of patients are adherent with injectables. That's right. It's a precipitous drop-off. And these things this is for life-saving drugs or even organ rejection drugs are 80-90% adherence. So we can't possibly expect patients or members to be adherent 80-90% of the time. They're going to be much lower unless we do the work for them and give them something in return. So I'd say that's, it's a startup mentality, which is you iterate like crazy. That's what Google does. They do 10,000 A/B experiments every day, and that's why they're doing so well. So I think we have to set up a learning mechanism in pharma.
I think maybe building on Cal's comments, I think scale to me is the number one thing that we have yet to see. And when I think about what it takes to get to scale, there needs to be a compelling reason for clinicians to use these things and for patients to use them for that matter. And then there needs to be a compelling reason for payers to provide reimbursement for them. And I think we're just on the beginnings of seeing both of those things tip. And I guess to my thinking, what will bring us there is clinical data. I think we've been in a world where there's been a lowercase d data and an uppercase D data. And tech companies think about data as being lots of stuff that may or may not say something. And pharma and biotech companies think about data as being data demonstrating efficacy in a randomized clinical study. And obviously, I'm very partial to this view of the world. This is what we do at Pear. But we think that developing this sort of data for these new digital therapeutics or digital interventions is really what it takes to get to scale.
Yeah, to me, I'm probably torn between usability and scale. Usability in the sense of coming from a different setup than healthcare, Amazon. I fully agree with you. The integration piece as well is strongly lacking. A lot of friction points are on the way in many places, and we're not necessarily good at that as an industry. It's still striking in many ways. That's why I find that the acquisition of Amazon and Clercq is really interesting, because when you look at their NPS scores, it's in the 70, 75 basically range compared to probably most of the experiences being happy if we had 20 or something along those lines. And I think there is no real appreciation for that. I think a lot of people in healthcare would not even really know what NPS is as well. So there is really a strong gap there from a capability point of view, from an appreciation point of view, what it entails, from even some thinking this is not our business to some extent because we're in the business of doing drugs. So there is a gap there that is important, where I'm optimistic about that, and that's where seeing tech and digital partners and pharma coming together could really be, to me, a big piece of that. That's why I'm sure we'll talk more about the partnership between Pear and Novartis and Sandoz is really important to me. Scale, likewise as well, because scale is, but I'm taking it from a different angle. It's how do we organize ourselves internally to be able effectively to go and give ourselves a chance to scale. I realize how difficult it is for startups, for partners to work with us because there are multiple entry points. We are subscale in many ways ourselves because we tend to replicate, you talk about 100, 200 countries, but we tend to replicate the same things with little pockets and pilots all over the place. I have, in many places, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams doing the same things with a quarter of an FTE. It's just not going to fly and not necessarily knowing about it. Now, easier said than done, but how do we organize? And lastly, on scale to me is also the data piece. Is how do we organize ourselves to get the right type of data sets, including some incredibly rich data that we have internally, to be able to go and mine that in a proper way.
Not much left. I think you guys covered it. Maybe one thing I'll add, which at one level sort of wraps a number of these topics together, and something that I've seen really firsthand in some of our companies is that, you can get all these pieces correct, but seamlessly integrating them. I mean, flawless execution, it's obvious at one level, but it's incredibly hard to do, of course. And one thing I never appreciated until our company started to get to a level of scale where that really comes under the lens is that in healthcare, there is no tolerance for screwing something up, right? Clearly, clinically, but even logistically, financially, if you've got a big customer, in a health center and a patient has a bad experience with your product because reimbursement got tripped up, and that patient sends a note to their doctor and says, I just got an outrageous bill that, you didn't tell me about, and I'm really pissed off. You'd be amazed at how that can filter through and the impact it can have, on that entire customer. They might just say, forget it, we're out. Like, we tried this product, we hit a little hurdle, blowback from patients, forget it. And so that sensitivity to Six Sigma execution is incredibly high. And again, something I just didn't appreciate until we got to the point where that mattered and you really started to see it. And that really is integrating all of these things along the lines of reimbursement, clinical data, technology, scalability, et cetera. But it's a real challenge, and small companies have to grow into that.
Very interesting. Now let's circle back a little bit to to the money side of things, because as we've seen, investments in digital health are actually on the verge of almost even rivaling investment in biotech at this point. Casper, you made an interesting point earlier today when we were talking, where you think that this is actually a little overheated right now.
Yep.
Can you expound on that? And Vijay, if you have any remarks on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously huge amounts of money. I don't know how whatever 10 billion is going to turn into 30 billion. That's kind of what we have to do to stay in business, call it 20 to 30 billion in returns. And I think there was a lot of, we can talk about the different phases of this, but I think there was a lot of engineering talent that came in and said, we're going to transform healthcare. And little did they realize how incredibly hard this is. We're all in the healthcare environment here, but there are all these different stakeholders, and they all have to be happy. The patient, the provider, the physician, the payer, pharma has to be paid, and all those elements make for really complicated commercialization. I also think that again, going back to the earlier point of iteration, Omada, which is a company we invested in recently, or several years ago, but recently has probably treated a couple 100,000 patients now, and have had millions and millions of interactions, or Talkspace, which is a company in New York, millions of interactions where they're constantly improving. And it's the same thing that we see in all of our apps. It's the way we live, right? It's this constant iteration. And I think it's a big mistake for a pharma company to say, you know what, we're going to blow 50 million on this solution and off we go. It's going to work for everybody. And so we have this real balance, I think, in pharma where it's got to be perfect with Six Sigma result, quality. At the same time, you want to iterate like crazy. And so you probably have to separate your dev environment and your manufacturing environment. But I guess just to summarize the point, I think way too much has gone in. On the other hand, I think this is kind of, I wouldn't say it's 1999, but I think there will be a second phase, there will be a second coming of digital health for sure, where all the stuff that we talk about at AI, there really will be a massive shift here where we go to anticipating what patients want with passive sensing, seeing how much your phone does these days, and Alexa does, being able to predict when your next dose should be and helping you with that. Not adherence, but helping you with your disease and simplifying it.
Yeah, so I would agree. I think that the environment is a bit overheated. We as a firm, we've been doing healthcare IT investments for 20 plus years, so we've seen the cycles up and down. We were investing in the mid to late 90s. We saw 2000. We saw the aftermath of all of that. But actually, a lot of the companies we invested in the mid to late 90s turned out to be successful companies. And so, it was one of those classic cycles of, everybody overestimated in the short term and maybe underestimated to some degree over the medium to long term the impact that many of those companies ultimately could have and did have. I suspect some of that is what's going on right now. People have been, we'll see if that continues with the markets the way they've been, but people have been exuberant, I think in part because the opportunity itself has shown itself to a broad set of investors, right? Now everybody understands $3 trillion a year, a lot of it wasted, growing unsustainably, has to be fixed. So the imperative of that opportunity, I think, attracts a lot of investors. And I think that from a timing standpoint, coming out of 2008, 2009, the government created a lot of incentive and momentum behind healthcare IT. And, you look at EMR penetration from 2008 to now, of course, and it went essentially from 0 to 100. And that creates a data ecosystem now that everyone can start to layer on. That's really valuable. But if I had to guess, and this is just my opinion, it's going to create a little bit of an artificial spike of activity, enthusiasm, exuberance around that will settle. And then over the long term, I think hard problems being addressed by companies and people that really deeply understand healthcare will turn out to be incredibly valuable.
So the investment, it's only going to keep going up at this point, and the entire pharmaceutical industry has already kind of started shifting even their managerial models to go towards increased use of digital technologies, whether for clinical trials, for tracking adherence, or anything like that. Bertrand, as I understand it, you were one of the first people to be named a chief digital officer for a major pharmaceutical company. First of all, what do you put on a resume and cover letter to get that job? And how would you kind of describe your responsibilities and your general approach to that kind of position?
I think I'll skip the first one. I think what attracted me to the space is probably the fact that I think there's an inflection point that's happening. When you see what is happening from, we can say it's overheated, but on the other hand, I'll put it the other way. If I were an entrepreneur, would I go into retail right now, or would I go into healthcare? I think without the shadow of a doubt, I'd go into healthcare. I think the market is bigger, there's a purpose side, there's an amplification, but indeed for deep expertise and the ability to make different parties work together, which is incredibly hard. I recognize that. I think what attracted me to the space, at least from my point of view, is the fact that, one, there was clearly a strong signal of seriousness within Novartis of wanting to go after that. It was at the right level as well in terms of ambition that we wanted to set up for this, and it was a blank canvas. So it wasn't digital as in digital marketing or just digital medicine or just census data or data analytics. It was, okay, we need to figure it out together. So as a management team, as an exec team, how do we go about that? I like the black canvas because then you can touch all areas. You can make the right trade-offs as well. There's massive, significant capital allocation we also make internally as well, so we don't take that lightly. There's a huge opportunity for partnership as well, thanks to probably the joint approach. Again, I think it's a great example to help us recognize which areas we are fairly weak on and where other startups much better than we are. So how do we work actually in that type of context as well? A lot to be learned from our side. But in our case, speaking concretely, there was a team to be put in place. Now we have over 1,000 people properly mobilized around this. We brought quite a bit of new blood as well about it. We have 12 key lighthouses that we have put into motion last year, and they range from in R&D to how do we optimize the type of clinical data set. We have 2 million patient years of clinical trial data that we've never properly leveraged because we always try to get a trial from point A to point B as effectively as possible without realizing the trove of data that we had behind that. But it's incredibly hard. It will take us 2-3 years to really organize that data. We are optimizing the way we look at our clinical trials as well, based on historical data. How can we predict when an investigator is not necessarily going to be on time and we don't have the right allocation that we have, when we're not recruiting fast enough, when there are some data logs that shouldn't be there, etc. We're working on the commercial side quite actively as well with a partner called Actana, another one called Shift, where they are helping us empower our reps. We still have 20,000 reps basically on the road. We might have discussions about that specifically, but in the meantime, as we have them doing a big part of the work, how can we enable them with the right type of data set to go and see the right doctors at the right time with the right type of messaging? All this is now live in 6 countries, in Japan, in China, in Germany, in France, in Spain, in the US, on more than 1,000 reps. We're planning to scale that to 10,000 reps this year. So that's where scale can come into play as well. We have 68 plans, where when you walk through our plans, you'll see a lot of it is still very manual. It's still a person, a leader of a plant. I'm hardly exaggerating, but in some of them, we'll be organizing the workforce of 200-300 people, literally on a board with flip charts of who goes where, who does what. That's probably the nature of high-margin industries to some extent, but clearly there are ways to do way better. And there it's probably more proven in other industries as well. So that's what attracted me. It's the fact that there are some which is very tangible, very actionable, doesn't have to be rocket science, but we can go after. There are some where it's probably middle ground, where it will take us time to organize the right platforms. And there are some which is, to me, the holy grail is on the research side. How can we completely transform the way we go after drug hunting as well, leveraging the type of data set we have, but also organizationally having way more data scientists at the right level in the organization to really go after that.
If I can maybe just add to Bertrand's sort of deep description of what's going on in Novartis. At BrightInsight Flex, we get to work across the pharma and medtech industry, and we're working with 80+% of the major players. And what we're seeing is a repeat of what you're describing across almost the whole industry. I mean, this is, as a former pharma executive, back in the day, you had digital as almost a shiny object. You were largely trying to describe or convince folks around why they should do something, and the classic app as an afterthought to some drug. And by the time that was launched, the person whose responsibility that was is off to their next role, and that was quote unquote digital. Today, we're seeing across the board virtually all of our customer base look at how do we build connectivity into all of our drug delivery devices, or at least our major programs. How do we start collecting vast amounts of data that we've never collected before through sensors, through passive means, through active means as well, et cetera, to enhance or accelerate clinical trials. And I think we're seeing this definite tipping point. I think one of you guys used that word, definite tipping point, where pharma and medtech is strategically investing to really fundamentally transform their product and the value proposition of their product versus sort of shiny object to help complement what their drug or device is.
So with all of this also comes a change in the regulatory environment. We've already seen that happening. Certain key elements of the 21st Century Cures Act are now starting to be implemented by the Food and Drug Administration. Scott Gottlieb, the FDA commissioner, has written extensively about proposals for paths to market for digital health technologies. Corey, you have some very firsthand experience with this, with what Pear Therapeutics was able to achieve with its RESET program. Why don't you talk a little bit first about the application itself, how it kind of works with the patient, and what did that regulatory pathway look like dealing with the FDA in the current landscape?
Sure. Happy to speak to that. So maybe by way of a bit of background, what we do at Pear is we create prescription digital therapeutics. These are pieces of software that are intended for use by patients under a physician's auspices to treat disease. We take all of these programs through traditional randomized clinical trials to demonstrate both safety and efficacy. We take that data to the agency to get a drug-like label. The product then becomes prescribable and it becomes reimbursable via either a pharmacy or a medical benefit because it's a product. We have both an NDC and a UDI for the product. So that's at a very high level what we do. If you move down to a bit more specificity, our RESET and RESET-O products are a suite of prescription digital therapeutics to treat different addiction conditions. So RESET is really a combination of an addiction-specific type of cognitive behavioral therapy called community reinforcement approach. It's combined with this thing called contingency management, which incents patients to continue to use the product and to display abstinent behavior. And those two things put together wind up producing an abstinence result, which in our clinical studies exceeded that of best-of-breed face-to-face care. That RESET product became the first piece of software to ever receive efficacy claims to treat any disease. So it's a watershed moment for us and arguably for the space. And then we have a related product, RESET-O, which is specifically for use to treat opiate use disorder. And that product is for use in combination with buprenorphine as a class. That product is the first quote-unquote drug software combination. So the first piece of software for use in combination with drug to produce an efficacy effect. That's a lot of words, and I think what we've seen at the agency is a lot of forward thinking, but at the same time, a good deal of action on the basis of, I would say, existing thinking. And I think it's important to remember that the agency arguably cares about three things: safety, safety, and efficacy. And so I think there's a lot of interesting and forward movement around things like the pre-certification committee. We're a member of that group, and I think that there's a lot of great talk around how we regulate the space going forward. But our approach to date has been to quote-unquote run single variable experiments. And so what that means is that we work with the agency in existing clinical trial paradigms. We look at existing approvable endpoints, and the only thing that we ask the agency to think about is the fact that the thing that produces efficacy is software, as opposed to a drug product or a medical device. And I think what the agency knows how to do is regulate software. They've done that for things like tech-enabled glucometers for quite some time. They know how to regulate products that create efficacy. They've done that for drugs for years, but they haven't known how to bring the two together. And so that's really been our approach to date. I think you'll see a good deal of evolution out of the way that these products are ultimately evaluated and regulated. But we've got, I think, 4 files in parallel that are open with the agency right now, all of which work on that single variable premise.
You could almost make the argument that we're underinvesting in digital health, right? If you think about how expensive it is to bring a biotech product to market, call it $1 billion, and how much it would be worth just if you had a novel molecule and you could improve efficacy by 10%, 5%, you got a blockbuster for the generic markets. Why not do that with adherence? If you can improve adherence by 15%, you've got a blockbuster drug, theoretically. So for as much as going to digital health on the sort of drug side, I think you can make the argument that there's a lot more that you could do just by improving adherence a little bit.
So let me ask the audience a question. How many of you have a healthcare kind of centered wearable device, whether that be a Fitbit, Apple Watch with the EKG? Let's just see a show of hands. Okay, so pretty much everyone in this room. Now, speaking of the Apple Watch specifically, there was a little bit of controversy, I would say, when the whole sort of the new Series 4 with the built-in EKG was introduced. I know that all of the cardiologists I follow on Twitter were like, "Oh my God, this is going to be a disaster because of all the false positives and things like that." At the end of the day, though, there is a trend towards this real-world sort of data collection. How do you kind of respond to the critics who say that this model hasn't really been proven for collecting good data in an effective manner?
Say that again. So which model?
So this kind of like real world data collection, the use of devices such as, say, an Apple Watch or something like that to inform clinical decision making or even drug development processes. How do you mitigate for things like false positives or
Mm-hmm. This is, I think, speaking a little bit, this is not intentional, but we invested in a company called Clercq. This is probably 6 years ago, and they were one of the first to have an FDA-cleared database for blood glucose readings. And the reason you had to do that is the FDA, obviously, if the data is incorrect and you're making a clinical decision on that, you've got a big liability on your hands. And so it's incredibly, and the FDA says, show me if you've got a blood glucose monitor here, you send it through the internet, and you have a blood glucose result of which you're going to make a decision here. That whole element has to be FDA cleared. I'm sure you lived that. So that I think is incredibly important to make that happen. But I would say I'm really surprised by Apple that they were able to get the claims they have. Because my suspicion was, look, this is going to be consumer grade. It's not going to be FDA requirements. And I still think it's going to be largely, I think they're very careful not to say you have an arrhythmia. They say go see a doctor and go from there. That's my 2 cents.
I think when it comes to this space, more is more. And when you ask a patient, I think they'll always opt for more data as opposed to less data. I think it's incredibly unclear what you do with any of that data, and that gets to implementation and scale. I think that's the fundamental set of questions that all of us are hovering around. At Pear, we've sort of taken the under on this movement, which is to say that we believe that clinicians and patients act for one reason and one reason alone, and that's the creation of efficacy. And that if you can't create efficacy for a patient, that they're probably not going to use these things in any sort of a sustainable way. And that may or may not be true, but I think you'll continue to see this proliferation of things that give you more data and a lot of questions around what in the world anyone does with that data. And I think we'll continue to wash, rinse, repeat around that until we get it right.
Yeah, I think the Twitter comments you're talking about and just building on Corey's comment, they're alluding to this fear by practitioners, which is how does this integrate into my workflow? Right? And I think so much of digital health innovation never thinks through, right? I'm sure you see this with the startups. At the end of the day, you're not going to get scalability. You're not going to get efficacy in the real world if you don't integrate into the workflow. And so, I'm not talking about Apple here specifically, but whatever innovation you're doing, you have to say, what's the insight I need to put in the hands of who? How do I integrate it into their life? Whether that's the patient, the caregiver, or in the case of the doctor, you're going to be thinking at the level of their EMR. And so, when I still see this today, which is pharma and medtech companies that are investing in their own solutions and their own closed systems, and you say, well, at the end of the day, how many doctors are going to say, I'm going to log out of my EMR, minimize my EMR, log into, it doesn't matter how big of reach you have, Novartis, right? And say, I'm going to log into Novartis' portal, remember my password, figure out how to go through all the privacy security stuff to find that specific patient's insight, and then use that into my clinical decision making. It's not going to happen, right? And so you got to think about think about that, and I think whether you're talking Apple Watch or any other innovation, is you got to put the insight at the right place at the right time for the person to make a better decision.
I think, well, I'll add one more thought just on diabetes, where I've spent a lot of time, and I think, I've spent some time with various companies, but Novo in particular, I think has done an amazing job of beginning to integrate, pens, blood glucose readings, just like we saw in, type 1 patients where they want a closed loop system. It seems like that's well overdue, right, to have a pump that knows what your blood glucose is with an indwelling sensor and titrates it automatically. But we're back to the safety, efficacy problem with the FDA. But that's coming, and I would say that very much the same thing is going to be true with type 2 diabetes. The main thing, the primary thing you hear from a person with type 2 diabetes is simplify my life. And so the idea of not having to write down what my blood glucose is, but the blood glucose reading going to my phone and then telling me how much my dosage should be on an insulin pen and knowing when I last took my dose, all that stuff could happen in background. But again, obviously the problem is not collecting data for data's sake, but actually making it usable and with minimal friction for that patient.
It comes back to your point, Casper, from earlier about, you're talking about usability again, right? Yeah. There are bad tech companies and there are great tech companies trying to address the same problem. Some just don't remove enough of the friction, some are incredibly at removing that. You're right, it's how do you get integrated into the EMRs and into the workflows in a proper way. It's going to be how do you make sure that doctors don't get bombarded with smart alarms where they end up, or nurses for that matter, that end up actually ignoring them because there are way too many as part of that. Some will get that right, some won't get that right. It's in our relationship with Pear as well. It's like, it's not easy because as much as it's, to some extent, there's so many analogies with a drug as well for an HCP to be prescribing to a substance use disorder patient. At the same time, there's, but is it really? Or is it's an app, how does it really work? Who is supposed to go and download it? Or if I'm a 45-year-old, son and my mom needs to go and download it afterwards, it's like, how do I explain that as opposed to just swallowing a pill, which has been the habit for years and years? So there are plenty of tiny friction points that go back to the tech world and the way we operate in that space that will need to be nailed in a very proper way. And I think that's what will make the difference between the great companies who get that, who iterate extremely rapidly, and others as part of that. But the fundamental point being more data is more, I don't know, but at least we need something to happen. We still live in a world, in MS, for example, where the endpoint is still a 6-minute walk test. It's still going to a hospital to walk for 6 minutes on the line to try to see if yes or no there's a progressive piece on that. That cannot be right. So surely there are better ways as well to go after that.
The most recent Deloitte report about pharmaceutical ROI found that in 2018, it actually fell to a new low. In 2017, for the major biopharma companies, it was already at something like 3.1% ROI for R&D, and now it's even lower. Do digital technologies have the potential to reverse that trend? And if so, how? How would they be used? Bertrand, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm highly alarmed about that. It moved from 10% to 3%. It's not return, it's return on capital employed, but it matters absolutely significantly. So that's why I'm here. That's why we need all the help we can get on that. That's why we are doing things actually in a very different way as well, with Corey and team basically as part of that as well. And it's not just Pear, it's because there's an entire portfolio of digital therapeutics that we believe in as well behind. We just made our bet actually on what we think is really one of the very, very best one basically in the market. I think it's more than data and digital therapeutics. It's also the broader data set. It's also, right now we're still in a world where we try more than return on capital. It's roughly on average 2.5 billion, more than $1 billion, and 12 years to get a drug to market. So how can we shrink the time to get it? We still live in a world where it's 10,000 experiments to get to one compound that effectively works at the end of the journey. And it's still very manual. It's still pipettes and driven by bench scientists in a very linear way. So how can we we see many companies who are starting to really help us think about what are the 500 to test as opposed to, so I'm not going in silico right away, but what are the 500 to test as opposed to the 10,000 so that you can get much faster on that. Many are working on patient recruitment in a very different way. Why don't we start on Google for that matter? Many patients start on Google doing their search about I may have a substance use disorder issue. I'm worried. What do I need to do as opposed to recruiting patients in a traditional way? A lot of the steps are still incredibly manual in the way they are happening. The endpoints are still very 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago in some case. How do we prove the case and build it up with the FDA? And it's true, Scott Gottlieb is incredibly progressive on that point. Again, I come back to the point of why did I join is because I'm hugely excited about the potential of what we can do. And maybe one last one to me, which goes maybe a bit beyond the discussion we're having here, but look, you might have seen that we made some investment where we divested our OTC from GSK. We made a 8.7 billion acquisition of Avexis in SMA and muscular atrophy for kids. We also passionately believe that to get approvals much faster, also to really get the buy-in from the FDA, how can we really go into truly innovative medicine? So how can we go, a lot of medicines are a fairly marginal improvement on a small subset of use cases that exist. So how can we really go after the one that are groundbreaking on that front? I would argue, and Avexis is one of those in cell and gene. That's why we went after that. We went after that big time. Our investment in endocyte and in AAA, in radioligand, are completely along those lines as well. So I think that's the other side of the equation that we are considering with meaningful cash allocation as well into that space.
Cal?
Yeah, just to build on that, a couple of comments I would add. So I think Bertrand spoke well about how do you accelerate the clinical trial timeline and the speed and the cost associated with that, which obviously will drive ROI. The other aspect, of course, is how do you get more revenue after you've gotten that product to market. And I don't think we can say enough about the point you alluded to, Casper, right around adherence. And so, here you have a drug with, $2.5 billion of investment put into it, X thousands of dollars of reimbursement, and 50% adherence, right? So I mean, it's not new news to anybody in this room, but I think it is astonishing to me still today how little time, effort, and money is spent to improve adherence. And I think I would say, I completely agree with sort of your question about the hype coming full circle. I would say there's a massive amount of underinvestment in that kind of digital health. And so if I'm sitting at the board of a major pharma company, I have to be asking that question of, do we spend another $2.5 billion on some incremental innovation in a space that has a whole portfolio of very effective drugs, or do I spend $1 billion on trying to crack adherence? I mean, imagine sort of that question, and what could you do to adherence if you've picked an important therapeutic area where you have a major position as a pharma company and said, I'm going to disrupt the heck out of that by throwing a fraction of how much I do to just get one incrementally better drug out to market. That probably isn't going to have any better adherence than the previous 90.
I got to pick up on adherence. We've invested a lot in technologies that go into clinical development and have seen that over 20 years as a ripe area for disruption, starting with Phase Forward, which was really the first electronic data capture. I mean, literally taking handwritten facts, illegible, often erroneous data, in your clinical study and putting it into your central database. So, that was 20 years to 10 years ago, call it, although you'd still be surprised, the level of technology that's sort of missing there. But on the adherence side, one of our companies specifically is focused on both the clinical development, adherence in the clinical development environment, as well as the patient side. And on the clinical development side, you think about a phase 1 study, oral medication, you're sitting in a study unit, right? Somebody is face-to-face with you, direct observation of therapy, you take the pill. Great. So I know you took the pill, 100% adherence in a phase 1 study unit. You go into phase 2, and it's like, okay, well, here's your punch pack of, 50 pills. Good luck, right? And they know things like if you go outside, the study units where people have to come in and be checked periodically and look in the bushes, you'll find a bunch of medications, right? People punch them out the back of the pill packs. People sign up for clinical studies multiple times and, of course, never take the medications just so they can get paid, right? So these things happen. Everyone knows they're happening. They integrate it into the way they think about powering clinical studies. But, that's probably a loss of at least 30, maybe 50% of the statistical power of your study. And you just have to overcome that, right? So to me, I think there's enormous opportunity, but it always helps to think about these very tangible, specific things and problems you can then go solve.
I think maybe just one quick thing to add on ROI. I think we've hit all of the levers, and any of the analysts in the crowd should be really proud. I think the one that we left out is real-world data and reimbursement. And it's a terrible thing for ROI if you wind up having a product that succeeds in clinical studies and then either clinicians don't write the scripts or payers don't pay. And so I think the means of being able to collect patient-facing outcomes at scale along with your drug is really going to be what unlocks the reimbursement puzzle. And I think what you're going to see is that drugs without some sort of a digital drag-along that directly demonstrates that patients are in some way engaging and that there's some degree of a patient-facing outcome that's achieved, I think it's just going to get harder and harder to get those drugs paid for.
It's hard to say this again as an industry insider. It's harder to find an industry that more proactively tries to not learn about their customer base.
You hit
You know, it's
exactly
like, how do I not
Present
learn about what's
company
actually
excluded.
happening with my users? You know, but that's the I mean, obviously this room and all of us are trying to change that, but that's the reality,
I
right?
think that's the essence
and,
of it.
and when you go learn about them, you're doing this in such a regulated, structured, environment that you're not getting the real world snapshot.
ROI is about revenues, right? Who here loves their pharmaceutical company? I mean, other than when you're working for it.
I like mine.
Right? Right. Other than the one you're working for. But I think that, we've seen this, you've seen it as Amazon. I mean, every one of these companies, every one of these industries is getting disrupted where the manufacturer is directly relating now to the customer.
Yeah.
And I think one of the issues with ROI in this industry is that it's incredibly hard. It's harder and harder to develop new drugs. And there's a massive need for chronic disease management. And all those drugs are becoming generic if they aren't already. So the ROI there is getting market share at this stage. And how do you do that? I think by differentiating yourself with patients. So I think we haven't really talked about that, but it's a massive opportunity, I think, for any pharma company to say, how do I build a relationship digitally? Because, my phone is everywhere. That's my digital me. How do I build a relationship with that patient directly? I don't know how you think about it, Novartis.
Yeah, maybe just two more concrete examples about the ones you're touching on, which is, I think Clercq is being very modest, because when you talk about reset, for example, it showed twice the efficacy in clinical studies, twice the efficacy of the current standard of care. So that's quite meaningful for something that doesn't have the same development cost as plenty of other means on that front. So that's why we're embracing that, of course. Still, it doesn't come easy though, because it's still actually, even for us as a mindset, we create a drug. Drug comes after phase 1, 2A, 2B. I mean, you know the drill, but it's a final product. It's pretty much what it is, and then you do label extension, etc. Versus here, reset is probably, if I can call it that way, it's probably the worst. In the current version, the MVP the current version is probably the worst version that will ever be if we do it well, because it means that we'll keep iterating all the time. We'll have our teams, but it doesn't come easy because our teams don't necessarily think that way, haven't been trained that way, it's not educated that way. So how do you make sure that the teams are really, really together on the ground as well in the addiction centers and others? Those are things we face every day as part of it, and we're cracking that, and I think we're doing a good job at that. But those are the reality. Just to pick on real-world data as well. I just want to give some credit as well, where it's due to the commission as well on that front, and Gottlieb and the team, is, for example, right now we're really pushing, it's within Novartis, but I think it's much broader, of secondary data first. So how do we avoid doing phase 4 studies or observational trials as well systematically? So now we've really taken a stand as much as we can to use real data that exists out there, that is not in an artificial stage, potentially into the clinical trial setting, but purely based on data as opposed to running the trials themselves. That saves a lot of time, a lot of cash, a lot of speed to market as well, plus a lot of efficacy, a lot of speed to get extension to patients as well as part of it. So I think you see a lot going on, but we need to organize ourselves. The tricky piece as well in this industry, you touched on it, is it doesn't come from just one player. It needs startup entrepreneurs and us to work well together. It needs the commission as well to buy into it. It needs us to be a bit more forward-looking as well, and to go to the commission early on some products like those as well, to say, look, would you not? Which ones would you back? As opposed to having everything completely, perfectly ready before we effectively have the dialogue, because we tend to be scared of those kind of things. But you can sense it's moving in that direction, though.
I feel like that's as good a time as any to maybe start taking some questions from the audience. I'm sure many of you have questions for our distinguished panelists here.
Thank you. So my name is Rohan Berji. I work for Mukherjee, Darmstadt, Germany, or EMD Serrano here in the US. And our approach to digital is even more complex than our name. So I have a question really, Bertrand, to you. in terms of how you're actually set up within Novartis, let's say between yourself, between the IT organization, because you referenced, I think, some paradigms which I see a lot in our organization too. You know, replication at every different country level, in every different type of unit. So I'm just curious, how are you approaching that? If you can offer some insights, that would be useful.
Sure. So there are, at the time, almost on day one, there were quite a few teams that we agreed to move across because it made more sense to be centralized. Like take BD&L, business development, for example, take social media, we moved across, take digital governance, we moved across because it was replicated all over the place. So probably 6-7 teams that we moved there. There were some pretty obvious gaps, like in data science and AI. We had plenty of sort of community self-organizing, so that we decided to give proper leadership as well as part of that. We had someone called Sharam Ebadolahi, who was employee number 1 at IBM Watson Health. On data strategy, we had obvious gaps as well, so we had taxonomy all over the place. We had no microservices being organized in any shape or form. Someone effectively mapped all of our different layers, and it was different setup everywhere. So there we had a guy from Google who had been building the B2B knowledge graph, so who knew about scale and who knew how to organize that. It was really having a big impact. And then there are quite a few teams, however, where we looked at what's the talent level that we have in the different key regions, and how can we have the right harmonization around that, and at what level are they? Taking Sandoz, we had a role open with plenty of people doing digital, but it was not at the right level. And we have someone that Corinne knows very well called André Hegg, that we attracted middle of last year. He's an entrepreneur, but at some form of scale. And we make sure with the head of Sandoz that he sits on his leadership team. In the US, we have a great talent who sits on the leadership team as well, for example. I'm in touch with him every single week, being one of our most important markets as part of that. So I could go on and on, but it's how do we elevate it? How do we give it the right visibility? I think the 12 Lighthouse was important as well, because it allowed to say, as an executive committee, how do we sign up the check as well on each of those, so it's not touch and go all the time, and then you know the drill, things disappear very, very rapidly. And then there are more mundane things we're doing, like on the, we just launched a platform, for example, where all the countries can effectively raise their ideas via that platform. So that it's not an idea generation platform, it's more so that the project surface, because they're always hidden in the budget everywhere, so that then we can do a job of curation with the teams to see where there are duplication, triplication, so that we can simplify. And it's a tough one, because there are many projects we're closing on the back of that, but on the ones that we really want to amplify, how do we give you more resource and line them up as part of that? So there's no magic trick, but I think we took it very seriously in terms of the level at which we wanted to invest in that.
And maybe just quickly adding from, again, from a BrightInsight perspective, where we're seeing this across pharma and medtech, a couple of quick comments. The one constant we see is a substantial increase in investment in digital. However, no two companies that we're seeing are doing it the same way. There's a slightly different flavor of how that's being executed, though I think there's a common theme building on Bertrand's, besides sort of investment and elevation. Where we see real speed of progress within a company is sort of these 4 areas coming together around something, which is you got to have the right leadership from a product perspective, like who's the business or product person, right? Whether it's in the development organization or the commercial organization that's going to be responsible for the value creation, right? The ROI. Who's driving this from a device perspective? Because ultimately we're talking about regulated healthcare, and so it's usually some type of device leader who can understand that, hey, this becomes part of our combination product in the case of pharma or the device in medtech. The third is the IT leadership, right? And so again, we're ultimately talking about technology and data here. And then the fourth is that COE coming in from a digital perspective, right? That's bringing the approach to say we're not going to innovate in the space the way we've always innovated in the traditional drug or device way. We need to innovate differently, but you still need to do it in the context of those 3 other groups. And so that's one commonality we see across companies. When we see them successfully move stuff at a reasonable pace through digital innovation, those 4 types of roles are coming together around that project or problem.
And maybe one more thing to make it very, very real, I'm sure those are the pain points that I heard as well, at least on our side, is I brought quite a few product owners from my previous life as well, so which is a tricky one, because you need to find people who really are domain experts and who know how to navigate through regulatory. We created a guild as well with legal, compliance, regulatory as well together, who are really brought into the tent, so they can be the friend as opposed to being seen as the enemy, for them being seen on the outside. But it's hard work. For example, our product owners are struggling at times. It needs the right EQ as well to navigate, because for many of those, they live in that, unfortunately, in that hybrid world where we all know we need to move there, but then when you build the product teams around it, you get people on 10, 15, 20 people of 20% of their time, because there's such an appetite to go for it right now that everybody wants to be on it, everybody wants to be part of the digital teams or the IT teams, but it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work on goodwill of being 10% of your time. It breaks at one point in time. It just doesn't scale. So there we're making a lot of very tough calls about where do we take people completely off their role so they can be 100% allocated to that. That's one of the hardest to do, because it's not native within the spirit as such.
Juan Pablo Mas with Action Potential Ventures, a subsidiary of GSK. Just a question on business models. Obviously, payment, and Corey, you spoke well about it in terms of the importance of providing data that supports reimbursement and answers that question for the existing payers today. When you think about the number of dimensions with which tech companies have explored creative business models in order to pay for their products, and even evolved their business models from freemium software to then data companies, effectively with so many of the tech companies in the Bay Area, et cetera. What, if any, to all of you, to any of you, have you seen that's a ray of hope for future business models in the healthcare space, given today's business models are pretty clear, or certainly constrained by the existing structures?
I can give you something. I'm going to speak to Corey's point, which is having spent some time on, again, this is a blood glucose monitoring company that showed they could reduce HbA1c by 1%. That's a blockbuster drug. Could not get a single payer to pay $50 a month for that service. And I think that's one of the powers of big pharma, is able to make that scalable. I think that collaboration between pharma and digital health companies is absolutely essential. The only place where I've seen it, or one area where I've seen the exception to that, is again, Amada, their Livongo. Like, the exact counterpoint is Livongo, same exact solution, went directly to employers, and they got the employers to pay for it, and that has slowly become a medical benefit over time. So that's another scenario. But I think one of the biggest things that we look for, and that's constantly missing, this idea of you can't just show up with and hope to do an early study and feasibility study and expect to get paid. You've got to go collect your data first. In healthcare, you've got to go to the FDA, and then it goes to that's a well-worn path of, we got regulatory approval, I'm going to show PK or pharmacoeconomics that it works, I'm going to go convince a bunch of payers, I'm going to go in-service hospitals. That's the ecosystem, and you can't get around it, I don't think.
I think there have been a lot of plays to attempt to get around it, and I think in a lot of ways, Digital Health 1.0 was predicated on software is cool and self-insured employers will pay for everything. And I think only one of those two things turned out to be true. I think it's really hard, and when you look specifically at our model, it is again to turn these things into products. So it is to take them through a regulatory approval process, so that they become something that the healthcare infrastructure can recognize and reimburse. And I think it's really hard to get new CPTs and to run a service-based business. I think that's really hard, and for us, again, getting the approval is certainly critical, because we don't do health and wellness. We only do things where there's medical risk and where the approval is required, but at the same time, having that product code is everything.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I mean, not to take the wind out of the sail, but this is the environment we're in, and actually you can be very successful in that environment if you do things correctly, right? But it depends on clinical data, and it depends on weaving together the right, often complicated pharmacoeconomic story, right? And Casper and I were both involved with a company called iRhythm that navigated a very complex, and initially challenging reimbursement environment, and ultimately had to create a very clear story around what we eventually called the diagnostic odyssey of the patient, right? So it wasn't just clinical data. We knew it worked. We knew it gave you great, very accurate, insightful data. But for payers, we had to be able to show that, you know, if you take a patient that wanders into the doctor with vague symptoms, this is what ultimately happens to that patient. They wander through the system for 6 months, they pop into the ER, this or that, and it costs you X thousands of dollars, right? Or this product can fundamentally change the cost trajectory of that patient. That's not easy to do, but ultimately is absolutely necessary, and was a fundamental building block of the business, and I think why that business is as valuable as it is. So it's challenging, it's a high hurdle, but frankly, I think it's necessary, and it forces the right type of discipline on these things to be solving meaningful problems and showing the right data.
What you're doing, I mean, I don't know how much the first product costs, but, you know, spending $50 million to collect good clinical outcomes data is trivial in pharma. It's, you know, it's a hell of a lot more than you expect to spend for a software company, but you can't get there on 5, let's put it that way. So I don't think they're big numbers, but there's clearly an ROI there for a drug.
I think all of that
Drug
said,
equivalent.
there's a tension here.
Yeah.
And that to me is the most interesting thing about this space, and it's the reason why I'm here. You know, when we're out fundraising, for example, and we are pitching to tech investors, you know, you don't have your traditional SaaS metrics, and they look at the cost to run a clinical study, and unless you're pitching to one of the founding partners, it ain't going to get done.
Right.
On the other side, if you're pitching to a biopharma investor, as soon as you're talking about anything that has anything to do with software, their eyes glaze over, and if it's not one of the founding partners, it's probably not going to get done.
Yeah.
So this is an emergence. This is hard. These things don't exist today.
Yeah, maybe the one thing I'll add to that, the question was around reimbursement, is I fundamentally don't believe, though, that in the long term that reimbursement is going to be built on inputs. It needs to be built off of output, and meaning the value side, the value-based care, to use that expression side. And I think though I acknowledge the challenges that you know, everybody on the panel said, I actually think pharma and medtech is best positioned to actually drive that disruption if they have sort of the heart and willingness to do it, because they're already well-tuned machines at getting reimbursement today, and now to come back and say, we're the ones who are improving our products through this digital innovation, and we want to change the basis from just being an input to being paid for adherence, or even better, being paid for, you know, outcomes, et cetera. They're the best position. It's so hard for a startup or a new idea to come in and, you know, do what Corey's done, which is climb a mountain. And if he was trying to do that and change the reimbursement paradigm at the same time.
I think the orchestra is starting to play us off now. But thank you all so much for coming here. I hope you found this as informative and interesting as I have. And thank you so much to all of our panelists for making time for this today. All right.